Wow, get my great thing about being in Edinburgh, you get your morning workout just going across the stage, at the conference centre. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I must say that in one moment I thought, well, why does a group of distinguished people thinking very hard about pensions want to hear from a historian? Because after all, the world of pensions is very much about the world of the future, and the world of the historian is about, as W.H. Auden rather memorably put it, breaking bread with the dead. But then what I want to say for the opening of these remarks is that the history and the present, if not the future, are more threaded together, braided together inextricably, really, than most people imagine. This was brought home to me anyway by a wonderful moment when I was a Don many, many years ago, 40 years or more, at Cambridge. And I was I had the kind of window open on a warm May afternoon. These two rather wonderful blue-rinsed American ladies from somewhere on the more elegant side of the Appalachians, perhaps Tennessee, were walking around First Court of Christ College, Cambridge, and one said to the other, "Oh, Mabel, don't you just love history? It's so old." And now I'm in my 70s, I know exactly how they feel. There is this sense, actually, that history, and it's been debated from the very beginning of Western history, and don't panic if you think you're going to get a history tutorial. You are, just for a bit, but it's possibly, thanks to kind and generous Lesley, no bad thing. But I want to say a word at the beginning about what history is supposed to do, how it does connect with our present and future. And history's always come with a different variety of costumes and hats and self-describing purposes. In the first place, of course, it is just the Downton Abbey model, really, of history. That's to say, a stroll down memory lane, a kind of costumed promenade. I love that. How many of you saw the last slightly unbearably happy episode of Downton Abbey? But I did love the moment given to Maggie Smith when the expectation was that sitting in yet another wedding in her pew, that she was going to produce a kind of verbal rhapsody for once about being English. And somebody says to her, why do you think it is, lady whatever, flabbergast, that the English are the way they are? And she says, well, so some people say it's our history. Personally, I blame the weather, which I thought was a nice way to put it. But the Downton Abbey model of narrative entertainment is important, partly because it actually doesn't just amuse and entertain us, but it also puts us into a kind of communion with all the generations that come before. And behind that entertainment nexus is a much more profound sentiment, first articulated, it is said, by Cicero, that those who do not know whence they came from know not whither they will go, and thus remain in the condition of a child, which could bring me immediately to the American political campaign, and I will return to that just a little later. The very first historical masterpiece in the Western tradition is produced by Herodotus, and it begins with the use of the word historia in Greek, which my better educated classical friends and academics remind me meant two things at the same time. One, it means just in the first sense of what history is supposed to do, a narrative, so that the deeds of the Greeks and the Persians will not be lost to time, as Herodotus says. But it also has the sense of a forensic, and I use that word hesitantly in this company, but a forensic analytical inquiry. In a kind of intermediary position, I think, is the second role which history likes to play, or habitually does, and that's the role of collective self-reinforcement of the kind, and again I want to say a little bit about this a little further on, much in play in the referendum campaign about Brexit, about whether Britain should stay or leave the common market. There was a kind of romance going on about the idiosyncratic indispensability of our own particular history. And in the United States, where I mostly live, the sense in which you go to history in order to discover, in effect, the genealogy of the wonderfulness of us or now has this kind of weirdly self-reinforcing quality and character to it, which is, in fact, deeply, while it is a kind of warm and cuddly kind of history, while it's a feel-good history, the kind of history that gets you to go to sleep happily, I'm in favor, as I was very struck by one wonderful thing, one of the many wonderful things that Yanis Varoufakis said earlier, that history is also about staying awake at night. He was trying to provide an alternative to staying awake at night, but history's role is insomnia. History's role is a gadfly. The honor and virtue and strength and clarity and merciless truth-seeking of history is all about being a thorn in the side of received wisdoms and complacency. And no one knew that better than this guy, Thucydides. Yes, everybody, they did tell you there will be an exam before you're allowed to go to lunch, actually. So I hope you're boned up on your Thucydides. Moreover, Thucydides, in my favorite version, if you feel like taking this to bed as your bedside reading, in Thomas Hobbes's version, great translation of 1628, published both in 1628 and then with an additional preface in 1629. It's one of the great masterpieces of English literature, in fact, falling as it does between the Meditations of John Donne on the one hand and that other sheetrock of how we should think about the benevolent idiosyncrasies of our own political community, Milton's Areopagitica, about which there will be another exam later this afternoon. Want to know why we love a free press? You have to read Areopagitica. So Thucydides is our hero, everybody, and a severe, austere, flinty figure he is. And he is a figure very interested in pensions, actually, as it turns out, because he was a sacked general in the war he describes, in the Peloponnesian War. He was a protagonist of that which he chose to present as history, and history very much in the mode of great, gripping, page-turning, spellbinding storytelling. Hobbes says of Thucydides, absolutely correctly, that he makes the auditor turn into a spectator. And what you're spectating in Thucydides are many of the things which actually are disruptions, are concern us now, particularly concern you lot. If you want the most extraordinary account of the social disintegration that happens in the face of a biological pandemic, read Thucydides' account, it's very short, of the plague in Athens. All the great sententious aphorisms and epigrams and nostrums which hold the community together, not least Pericles' deservedly great and famous oration over the dead in Athens, disintegrate within days when the plague strikes and are replaced by all kinds of social and economic anarchy, the kind of thing that Hobbes would have had his antennae wired to, a kind of free-fighting sauve-qui-peut. And then Thucydides says something incredibly profound, I think, when he's, in between describing bodies tumbling out of houses, and he describes, again, this is wonderfully very much an auditor becoming a spectator. He describes bodies piled up by water conduits. These are people who've simply been clawing over each other in an attempt to get to a supply of water. And then Thucydides says the killer line that worse than any of this was the melancholy into which people had sunk. In a sense, it was the mental derangement, actually, of that moment, which caused the maximum destruction, the most paralyzing condition in which state and society and all social and economic institutions just stopped functioning properly. A lot of American students are actually given this great book in their core curriculum when they have one. I'm proud to say that my own university, Columbia, does have a great books core curriculum, which students often come in complaining that they've got to read, and then almost uniformly, I don't think I'm taking their name in vain, love it when they actually get to it. It's the one chance in their life they're going to be able to read Dante and Boccaccio and Dostoevsky and Virginia Woolf, to whichever destination they will end up. But very often, the chunk of Thucydides, which is extracted for them, is indeed that Periclean oration about why it is possible to contemplate sacrificing your own life on behalf of a democracy. And that kind of misses the nobility of this great book, which again is very much in keeping with, I think, the sort of intellectual and conceptual atmospherics of your own conference here. And that's to say, it's an exercise in self-criticism. It's built around a disaster. The disaster is the expedition of the Athenian fleet and army to Syracuse in Sicily, which turns into a catastrophic defeat for the Athenians. It's an account finished because Thucydides died before the whole book was finished, but the overwhelming part of it is his own by Xenophon. And it is fronted, it's prefaced by an extraordinary balloon debate, I guess, between Nicias, who's the old general in charge of the expedition, and who tries to say, if you are going to contemplate this terrifying jump into jeopardy, you better know exactly what the odds are and what you're doing. And Alcibiades, who's the young, flamboyant, glamorously charismatic military commander and loudmouth, who overcomes all of Nicias's cautionary comments in the name of the necessity of Athens going far afield to make sure that its sovereignty, not just in the Peloponnese but beyond, is actually imposed on those who dared to contest it. And the Athenians become a terrible cropper. One of the great scenes in Thucydides' book is the aftermath of the Athenian defeat, where he describes the army of 40,000 moving along in this pathetic, mutilated caravan of the wounded and the half-wounded and the defeatists, men leaning on each other, men who'd arrived just early, not long before, in a state of imagined euphoric invincibility, now reduced to this pathetic retreat. Now, to have a history book which is a cautionary exercise in merciless self-criticism, which is essentially a tragic account, is, as I say, the virtue, the honor, the candor, and the strength of the Western historical tradition. It's everything that Soviet history wasn't. It's everything that the more egregious forms of American self-congratulation aren't. It's everything that a totalitarian culture, be it a religious totalitarian culture, I mean, you can't think of any more ahistorical cultures, I would suppose, than fundamentalist religious cultures, whether they're Christian, Jewish, or Islamic. They essentially are obtuse to the complexities and to that tragic element which gives history its point, its definition, its reason to be. So I want to just say a word now in the second half of these remarks about what this sort of sense of cautionary, tragic, complicating role that history is supposed to play, what it says to three particular crises, which I also want to say towards the end of the remarks. How long do I have, Lesley? Time flies when you're having fun at the expense of everybody's lunch.
You've about 7 minutes left.
7 minutes? Good Lord, what can Thucydides do with 7 minutes, you know? Okay, fine, thank you. I will try and cover that, which are all really, I think, part of the same issue. The first is, because it's where I live for the moment, unless what I suspect will happen, and that will be inaugurating President Trump next year. Anybody passed out at this or needs smelling salts or sal volatile? Then you may see a quicker return of Schama to his old hunting grounds than would otherwise be the case. Trump is certainly not a totalitarian, although he is kind of fascism light. Here's an instance where history can misstep. The Holocaust analogy is used over and over and over again. I should say the Hitler analogy rather. Well, I also think, as a Jewish historian, both a Jew who's an historian and a historian of the Jews, that the Holocaust is invoked, particularly by the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu. And again, I speak as a very passionate, loyal supporter of Israel, much too cheaply and much too quickly and much too easily. But so is Hitler. Both George H.W. Bush and Margaret Thatcher describe Saddam Hussein as Hitler. He was not, whatever he was quite awful and vile enough without being thought to be a kind of latter-day coming in the Middle East of Adolf Hitler. So it is the case that Trump is not exactly Mussolini, but in the avoidance of cheap and vulgar and sort of plastic analogies, one can also go too far because there are certainly aspects. Trump's kind of mischievous appeal to acts of, for his sort of reality show, low-level violence, people being roughed up as they're taken out of, if they're a protester at one of his rallies. His extraordinary appetite for scapegoating. This is a political campaign where America is said to be poised on the abyss. Well, not all is well in the United States of America, particularly with income equality. But, you know, was I missing something? I, who lived through the crash and the credit crunch of 2008 and onwards, to think, actually, the abyss was yawning before us in 2008 when the Republicans were last in the White House. And again, I'm not a hagiographer of the present president by any means. But we have full employment in the United States now. It's 5% and actually 4-point-something% in most of the states. But there is the sense that actually there is something unsatisfied about a portion of the population whom structural changes in the nature of employment, particularly those in the world driven by digitally engineered productivity, have passed by, and that is certainly the case. It's not at all arbitrary that those who are the most ferocious in their chest-beating support for Donald Trump are essentially white males without a college education. Donald Trump made a kind of creepy joke about it, saying, yes, my support is strong among the poorly educated. Boy, do I love the poorly educated. And you know, you'd think that would turn off his support, but absolutely not at all. So when you're in that sort of position where you can't make an incredibly strong case, he does so, of course, in respect of being a protectionist. If Bernie Sanders, as might well be the case, will be nominated as a Democratic candidate, will have two protectionists competing for the White House. And what was the dreaded words "Hawley Smoot" were not actually invoked by Yanis Varoufakis in his excursion into the gold standard and post-First World War economic policy, but they may well have done, because that formidable protectionist tariff was the beginning of the separation of American economic interests from the fate of the rest of the world, with absolutely dire results. What Donald Trump thinks will happen if a trade war is actually initiated with China and possibly with Japan just beggars the imagination. But someone pointed out in a response to a tweet of mine, the statement, what Donald Trump might think, is itself more or less redundant to examining his candidacy. So this is a very, put it mildly, ahistorical campaign. The story he keeps on telling about General Pershing dipping bullets in pig's blood before executing Muslim prisoners in the Filipino-Moro War is complete fiction. It's completely unsupported by any evidence. The sense, indeed, in which what is exactly the nature, history lives and dies on the truth. And the truth of the matter about Mexican migration in particular is that there's a net outflow from the United States of about 140, 150,000 people a year rejoining their families in Mexico. And the immigration, both legal and illegal, has been dropping over that frontier at an incredibly steep rate since 2008. Again, not a coincidence, coinciding with the slowdown in the economy. So actually, if Trump builds his extraordinary war, for which horrible, chortle laugh of disbelief he imagines Mexico will pay, you'll actually be preventing Mexicans from leaving the United States, really, rather than the other way around. The second issue is refugees, and that probably was 7 minutes, wasn't it? Can we have a minute on each of the...
No, you can keep going, because we've got time for questions, but...
Okay.
I don't want to stop you.
The second is refugees. Now, here history becomes, objective history and personal history becomes a bit tied together. I'm not dreamy-eyed about the difficulty of resettling refugees, but you know, my own family life history is bound up with what happened to Jewish immigrants, whom both my grandparents were. My father's family from Romania, originally from Turkey, my mother's family from Lithuania, in the 1980s, in the late 19th century. In my knockdown skirmish with Rod Liddell on Question Time of notorious infamy, everybody thought I was talking actually about Jewish immigrants, again, invoking the Holocaust weepy moment, but I was actually talking about the 1880s. It was the time when something called the British League of Brothers was founded, and the Aliens Act actually passed through Parliament in 1905. But we actually settled in this country, not to mention that millions of Eastern European Jews, as well as Italians and Irish, who were settled in the United States at that time. And, you know, we were entitled to say historically, well, yes, but those immigrants did not actually profess an ideology fundamentally inimical to the democratic and secular way of life. But, whoa, we want to read the Rothermere newspapers. They don't sound very different from the way they do now in the 1890s and the turn at the beginning of the 20th century. And you read, some of it is true. My grandparents could not speak English. They had a different religion, the culture they came from. My great-great-uncle Leon was a notorious but not, I think, armed anarchist. He mostly used to scowl over chessboards by way of issuing his tragically empty revolutionary platitudes. But you remember the siege of Sydney Street. There was all the sense in which these kinds of people, we smelt bad, we dressed appallingly, we had ghastly kind of cooking, none of them could speak English. There was no way they could end up as British. And then you flash forward to my old dad, Arthur, punting me down the Thames at Datchet and Old Windsor, reciting Shakespeare at me, and forcing me at the age of 9 to learn Henry V's speech before Harfleur. And you realize just how wrong that can be. The Muslims who all thought to be in the most paranoid, neurotic version of the impossibility of settling 20,000 of them, include the kind of young woman who won the British Bake Off, the 12-year-old in a hijab, in a headscarf, who won, again, going back to Shakespeare, who we're celebrating this year, won the school's there was a wonderful competition for 12, 13, and 14-year-olds to actually orate passages by heart from Shakespeare. And this young woman, she was 13 years old, she was from a Sri Lankan Muslim family, won it by miles. It was absolutely amazing. And in the end, she had the killer speech, a real test, never mind balloon debates, having to recite off by heart to be or not to be. You know, the most difficult and the most hackneyed speech in all Shakespeare. And she just wiped the floor with everybody else. Very excitedly, Sam West and I went up to her parents and said, you know, we wouldn't say this, Sam had the authority, but your daughter, he said I would hire her for the National Theatre tomorrow. And the parents, absolutely incredibly brimming over with pride, said, but we want her to go into the insurance industry. Actually, you'll like that. You know, she may be one of your colleagues right now. You know. Thirdly, so I'm not starry-eyed about, and we have, you know, I'm actually hope the Turkish-German deal will kind of work out in some way, although we basically, in our desperation, we've capitulated to Erdogan in all sorts of ways, which I'm less happy about. Thirdly, of course, Brexit, and I really don't have time to save to say that, again, to invoke the romance of the uniqueness of British political institutions is to forget that basically our laws are a compound of Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman French. And our political system was the result of a Dutch invasion, an invasion it really was, in 1688, and a series of otherwise undistinguished Hanoverian German monarchs. I'm not, of course, saying that Britain hasn't got its own rights to crow and beat its chest about our particular political institutions. But nor do I think ultimately, again, I'm echoing Varoufakis, without at all being an apologist for the sort of grotesque remoteness and mechanically bureaucratic attitude to government that's the hallmark of what happens in Brussels. It's a question of whether or not we separate ourselves from the fate of Europe. And again, I thought Varoufakis was quite right to say that separate we may end up doing, but we will pay a price ourselves. It will be as naive as the famous headline, "Fog in Channel, continent cut off." We will not be cut off from the consequences of increasing the kind of entropy of the European Union. The world won't, and certainly not the economy we're talking about, is my belief. I suppose all these things are really about what is a national community. We're in Edinburgh here. We're in Edinburgh, which refused to go along with the Jacobites in 1745, but Edinburgh, which has the strongest sense of its own identity. We've not had a debate in the country at large, or indeed in the democratic world at large, or in the world at large, about what constitutes a national community. To what must you pay attention? Is it a shared tradition that somehow belongs to a pale face and a white skin? Which would be preposterous, absolutely preposterous. We can think of all kinds of examples. It's a wonderful thing that we see members of parliament and in the government and in leading industries. And, I listened to wonderful Raisa Iqbal and Michelle Hussein on the Today program and think we are actually, compared with America, a much more, I won't say unproblematically, there is nowhere in the world which is unproblematically a multicultural state, but Britain right now is a more pluralist community, living still in the sense of being bonded by a national community. So it won't surprise you to hear, I like nations which are a mixture. The kind of rush to tribal purity, whether it's in Hungary or in Russia, in the annexation of the Crimea, or in Donald Trump's incredibly white America, his paranoid hatred of people who don't look like him, is one of the great torments of our time. There are essentially three great problems facing our contemporary world. One is the slow death of the planet, which we need to try and arrest. Secondly is the staggering inequality between developed and undeveloped countries, and inside some developed countries between the rich and the poor, which is growing wider. But the third is, how do we create coherent national communities in which differences of religion, differences of opinion do not oblige the parties of those differences to oppress or even try and kill each other? How do we live with people who are not like us? That is also at the core of what an historian does. We go navigating through the centuries over space and time in search of people who are not like us. And this has been the source of my good fortune and my happiness, and the reason I've taxed your patience this morning. Thank you. Mm.